Brandice Sills-Payne from Fetcher. She is the Director of Experiential Marketing and Content Strategy at Fetcher and comes from a very extensive events background. So I keep meeting eyes with her throughout the conference and being like, oh, that went well, or you probably saw that, but hopefully no one else experienced it. Has produced some very, very large conferences and now is working at Fetcher to create experiences. Fetcher is bridging the gap between AI and recruiting. AI is a powerful tool, but we all know it's not a silver bullet to solve really anything, but especially in this case, unconscious biases and inherent biases that influence decisions around hiring. Tech is susceptible, as we all are, to, in this case, the people who make the tech. And so Fetcher is bridging the gap in hiring between the AI and the humans to create a better hiring experience for everybody. So can I get a round of applause for Brandice Sills-Payne from Fetcher?
Slight wardrobe change. So I want to give you a little bit of backstory on who I am and then how that kind of translates or relates to some of the machine learning tools that we're using here at Fetcher. So for the last 15 or 16 years, I've been working in event production, which is why it's all good, guys. Don't worry about it. But also for the last 6 years, I've kind of moved my focus into helping companies identify and train and retain diverse talent. So primarily a focus in LGBTQ plus people and also people of color. So my goal here for our time together is I really want to come out of the hypothetical. I know we spend a lot of time and a lot of resources sort of identifying the issues that we have, but the solution really comes in when we can listen to and also implement the solutions from the people who are being affected by all the negative and harmful practices that we're identifying, right? So humans hiring humans, how can AI help? All right, so I gave you a little bit of backstory on who I am. I told you I want to come out of the hypotheticals, which I think we should do, just to move the needle forward, right? And then also, I want you to use me as a resource. So I've been through a myriad of experiences, all too long stories to tell you in the 10 minutes or so that I have. But I want you to see bias through my eyes and how it affects me, how it affects a lot of people, and then how we can move forward. All right, so I've noticed that in a lot of cultures where there's a culture of sameness, they're coming up against a lot of issues against how do they change the landscape of their company, of how they hire, how they retain people, or how they even attract people to their company. For me, I've been the only one, a lot. And I've also realized that the more senior the role, the more likely it is that I will be the only one. And we can get into tokenism and the candidate experience, and that's a whole other conversation that I'm happy to talk to about offline. But I've been the only woman. I've been the only LGBTQ, IA identifying person. I've also been the only person of color. And in those instances, I've always found that it's harder to navigate that when I'm operating in an area where the dominant culture is cis, white, heterosexual men and women. And that's not to say that people who don't identify that way don't have bias, right? We all carry bias, we all have it. But this is just in my experience. So living at the intersection of my identities has been an interesting experience. Whether it's I have to really work to disarm people because of my identity, or if I have to do it and disappear and not be able to show up authentically and as myself. So here's a couple of assumptions people made. My age. My family tells me over and over and over again, I haven't aged in 25 years, which I hope never ends, right? I'm happy about that. But when I'm in a leadership role, it can be problematic. Also, the interests that I have. I have a more androgynous look. So a lot of my male counterpart or co-workers would invite me into sporting events, and they would invite me to, a bar after work, or like include me in misogynistic talk, assuming that I'd be interested in those things, which I'm not. I actually love puzzles and escape rooms and fantasy novels. And then there's the time where my gender and my race and my age come together. Quick story, back in 2007, I was hired to manage some of the auxiliary stages at the Super Bowl. And I came in as a technical producer or lead producer, and I walked up to the union crew chief and I asked him for a status update, introduced myself and said, hey, where are we in the process? How long has it been taking to set up? Can we change? What are we doing well? And he looked at me and he said, you're late. You need to go check in with the labor chief and find out where you're assigned, and you need to get to work. And I was a little thrown off, and I'm like, okay, this is awkward. So I asked him to look at his call sheet, and I said, well, what's the name listed as lead producer or technical producer? And he said, Brandice. And I said, well, here I am. And he made an assumption. Was it based on my, adorable baby face? Was it based on, that I was a woman, that I was a person of color? Like, who knew? But there was an assumption made. So, a little bias 101. We all have bias. We all carry it. Doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, how you come to view the world or experience the world. We all carry bias. Let's keep that in mind in this whole conversation. It's not a judgment, right? It's just the truth. Now, in my opinion, assumptions are the gateway, right? So let me give you a quick example. Let's say you need to hire a designer, right? You have 4 candidates, one of which is left-handed, and I can be a little biased because I am left-handed, but you believe that left-handed people are more creative. So at the end, you offer that left-handed person the job. Now, as soon as your assumption makes your decision, we call that bias, right? More money, more problems. So now the larger your company is, the more opportunities you have to insert bias into your hiring decision. You have that person that's sourcing candidates. You have that recruiter who's screening candidates. And then you have that manager who's conducting on-site interviews. At every touch point, that person has an opportunity to insert their bias into the process. Now, there are things that can safeguard against this, like standardized hiring panels and things like that, which should be in practice. But just recognizing and naming that these things are a possibility and being honest about how they affect our hiring decisions and how we interact with each other. So check yourself, or somebody will, right? Let's see. We can all learn bias. I believe like bias is like a learned behavior. So then why can't we identify our biases and then unlearn them, right? There's been a study that, and like I said, everyone has bias, right? So women can be anti-women. People of color can discriminate against people of the same ethnicity or race. We all have these things that are kind of baked into who we are. But naming and identifying it can also be a really, really powerful catalyst to change. So at Fetcher, we have this saying, we bring the right candidate to you. And we've gone back and forth a lot on what this means, but we were really intentional about saying right instead of best. So quick example, let's say you are a bootstrap startup and you want to hire the most amazing engineer in the world. That engineer might also have an offer from Apple or Google or whomever, and you may not be able to compete with the salary or the perks that they're offering. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's kind of unlikely. So maybe the right candidate for you is a person from a non-obvious background who's an amazing engineer, right? Who can help you grow your company. So what is the right candidate? And the truth on that is, if you are involved in any part of the hiring process, you are the person who gets to decide. And in that, kind of going back to the standard practice, what we talk about is, the people that are in these hiring panels, and your hiring panel should be diverse, because diverse hiring panels hire more diverse teams. There should be certain benchmarks they have to hit. And the hiring manager should also be very honest about the assumptions they've made or the choices they've made and justify that to each member of the panel in order to make the right decision. So, getting AI. How can AI help? This is where my cheat sheet comes in. So in a perfect world, AI would be coded to match certain skills and qualifications. Also, it would uncover proxies that lean toward career projection instead of other things that would be more bias prone, like university degree. You can also look at demographics. Race and gender actually shouldn't be a qualifier for what AI should search for unless you are trying to hire for that certain demographic. So if AI can find 10 female engineers living in the Bay Area, those are the candidates you want to choose from, that's a great resource to use to get those people in front of you. Now for extra credit, there'll be blind badges, right? So AI would send you a data set or a batch of candidates with no names and no photos. And maybe it does search for a university degree level, but not a specific university itself. All right, let's talk about developers for a second. Developers are awesome, they're amazing, they're way smarter than I am. But often they're under these really tight deadlines and they're really eager to make the tech work. So quick story, Google recognition, amazing idea. The problem was, it wasn't coded to identify faces of African descent. And in that, there's a bias. Now we can have a lively debate about why that happened. And we can say, was it too difficult? Did they not have enough people of color to train the data set? Or were they just biased? But the caveat to that is we do have amazing people building the tech. But what we really need is a relationship between humans and the people building the machines. It's kind of like double dutch. You know when to get in, someone calling in and saying, hey, your data set's not actually built to recognize African faces. And then you step out and say, hey, I might insert my bias here. I should step out and let the machine do what it does best. So we're super close to this. So let's just all remain mindful of how AI can be a solution, not a total solution, but a tool in our tool belt to help us insert into the process where we can remove bias from the hiring process. So in closing, AI is a part of the equation. I think it's awesome. I think it's pretty badass that it exists. But we have to use it in ways that make sense. And 16 years ago, I started my career. No one was talking about bias. No one was talking about unconscious bias. No one was talking about how hard it was to be a person of color, a woman in a male-dominated field. And these are all things that I was coming up against. And as soon as I started conversations about how we could mitigate these issues and really address them and solve them, I knew I wanted to be a part of the solution. And I worked for a company who their entire premise was to bring diverse talent in front of recruiters who needed to hire diverse talent. But it's a very manual process, and it's very expensive to do that when you do in-person events. And so while the work was really rewarding, I knew I wanted to do more. And then I found Fetcher. And Fetcher really understands the relationship between humans and AI and how important that relationship is. And also we can do it at scale for a fraction of the cost. So now it's more accessible to a lot more people. And that's really important for me because now we can unearth and we can uncover all of these amazing people who would otherwise be overlooked at a fraction of the cost. And we can give them a voice and a seat at the table to make sure we don't lose our way. Thank you.